is a 5-year-old girl who takes her brother's toy one day and doesn't want to give it back. When her father comes over and smacks her, he's entirely unaware of how much the physical pain will hurt her for the next half an hour, how much the bruising will hurt her for the next couple of weeks, and how much the emotional scarring will hurt her for the rest of her life. And all the while, ladies and gentlemen, that father is entirely unaware of just how unjustified he is. Team England today says that violence is never acceptable and never the answer. And in my speech, I'm going to tell you firstly about the harms of smacking, and secondly about the illegitimacy of smacking, and therefore why this ban is necessary and justified. Ben is going to come on to talk to you about the results of smacking in his speech. But firstly, what exactly do we mean in this motion? No, thank you. Well, today we're talking about any kind of physical contact which is intended to inflict pain at any age, with or without an implement. We're including violently shaking of children. All of this, we say, is wrong in all cases, whatever the motive, whatever the circumstance. Some of the repercussions we'd suggest would be a sliding scale of punishment, and indeed the capability of social services to take children away from their parents. So having established this, let's start with my first point, which is the harms of smacking. Because I'm going to talk to you firstly about the emotional harms, and secondly about the physical harms. So let's start with the emotional ones. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about fear. Children actively fearing their parents. We're talking about these children feeling unloved, and we're talking about these children feeling humiliated when this is in front of siblings or friends or the public. And that is because violently abusing children is a fundamental violation of someone's person. And this leads, ladies and gentlemen, to lower self-esteem later in life, and more importantly, it leads to a breakdown of the parent-child relationship. And we say on this side of the house that that is an absolutely fundamental relationship that we stand for. No, thank you. And so what happens with the policy advocated by this side of the house is that the 5-year-old child who's violently hit doesn't understand why his parents are hitting him. Doesn't understand that if they loved him, they wouldn't do that. Ladies and gentlemen, the 5-year-old doesn't understand why. The 15-year-old decides and vows never to speak to the parents for the next few days, possibly never to share personal information with that parent ever again. And ladies and gentlemen, these children won't go to their parents if they're abused elsewhere, if they're bullied at school, because they see these parents as bullies too. They see these parents as abusers too. And we say that's exactly what these parents are when they inflict these emotional harms upon their children. Yes?
Can't scolding a child also cause him to feel fear for a parent, to feel unloved and to lower self-esteem? And in that case, why don't you ban scolding a child as well?
Right, well, sir, I'm going to come on to talk to you now about why specifically violent punishment leading to physical pain is damaging. But we actually do believe there's a fundamental difference with a parent telling a child off, saying that's wrong, and whacking and hitting that child and actively instilling pain. No, thank you. And let me come on to tell you why that is, ladies and gentlemen. Because the physical harms are short-term harms, the stinging pain, and they're also long-term harms, like the bruising, ladies and gentlemen. And sometimes they can be even more serious harms. Firstly, there can be parents with the very best intentions who want to punish their child so that they can bring them up well. These are the parents who lose their temper. They can't control their power. They don't realise their own strength, and they go too far. And that's why the blanket ban is necessary, to restrict these parents from doing something that they don't intend to do in terms of inflicting pain, long-lasting pain on their children. We want to have a blanket ban so this is never even considered as an option by those parents. But there's a second group of parents too, ladies and gentlemen, the bad and abusive parents. And, no, thank you. And children don't go to other people when they're being horrifically violently abused, or indeed if they've been smacked by their parents. We talked earlier about the sense of humiliation. And the fact is that child abuse victims simply don't go and own up to what's happening at home. We would take it that the opposition agree with that simple statement of fact. No, thank you. And so, what happens under their motion, where this is sometimes acceptable, is the teacher or the social worker who identifies the bruising on the child, who slightly gets a bit concerned about this and who decides to take action, is confronted by a parent who says, no, I was only bringing up my child in the best way I know how, I was punishing him legitimately, I'm covered under the law. Well, we say that that's always criminal, and we say we don't want to give a get-out clause to these parents who will abuse their children and who will do so within the confines of the law and use the current law as an excuse. So having established the harms to children, let's have a look at the illegitimacy. No, thank you. Because there are two people involved in this debate, the children and the parents. Let's have a look at the rights of
Information,
both.
sir.
Yes.
Do you agree that there can be gradations of physical punishment? And if you can discriminate between these gradations, then we have no problem taking parents who excessively punish their children to court.
Well, okay, so you accept that in some cases when parents hit their children very hard, they are inflicting that pain, but you say that if they did so with a light and gentle tap, which clearly if they want to try and bring up their children properly, they wouldn't do anyway, we say in both of those cases the same emotional harms results. We say, in fact, yes, of course there's a sliding scale, we said that in the definition, but in both cases pain is caused, and we told you the harms of that. No, thank you. So let's come on back to these rights, because this to anybody else, ladies and gentlemen, would be assault. And that's because it impinges the right of physical protection. And we say on Team England today that that is an inalienable right. It is always the most fundamental function of the state, and that is because the state can't exist if it doesn't maintain law and order. And given that, we say it has to be extended to children, because we only currently restrict children's positive liberties, like their right to vote, or their right to drink alcohol, for example, which they only get at a certain age in different countries. And that's because they have to have some rational cognition in order to make these decisions and make them informed decisions. But we say with negative liberties, they are always afforded, and they're afforded to everybody. You don't need to have any rational cognition, no thank you, to have your person protected. So we say, in fact, children are actually particularly vulnerable. They need this protection more and not less, and we say we're justified in covering them. But the parents, ladies and gentlemen, let's have a look at those. Because we limit parental rights currently in society when these parents kill their children or inflict serious abuse on their children, when they don't send their children to school, when they neglect the child. And that's because parents have a positive duty to protect. They have different positive duties to protect, which we recognise and we accept. And that's why we say this is just an extension of the principle, given that we've shown you there are all of these harms to children. And so that's why we say that not only is this ban necessary because of the harms, but it's also justified because we do curb parental rights, we do curb the ability of parents to bring up their children and punish their children where those harms can be proven. And clearly in this case, they can be proven, as we've shown you. So what has Team England illustrated today, ladies and gentlemen? Well, we've shown you firstly how there are serious physical and emotional harms inflicted on children when their parents violently abuse them, and we've shown you secondly why that's completely illegitimate and completely unjustified in all of these cases. So because violence is never acceptable and never the answer, we beg you to propose.
It's fitting that on Valentine's Day today, I talk to you about love. Because love isn't always mushy. It isn't always cuddly and nice. Sometimes love needs to be tough. Sometimes it needs to be firm. And sometimes, when parents have children who won't be reasoned with, sometimes they need to use physical punishment to discipline their child for the good of their child. Before I move into my 3 points of contention today, I've got a single clarification to make. And that is, on side opposition, we criminalize the physical abuse of children. And that is defined by causing permanent physical and psychological harm, as well as the use of an extremity of violence. We tell you that courts have no problems using this yardstick to evaluate abuse, and they've been doing so in child abuse cases for years. We tell you that courts use this similar yardstick in other cases as well. For instance, in determining the difference between a minor scuffle in the street and what is grievous battery and assault. This principle works, and we don't think this is what the debate is necessarily about. We're telling you that we criminalize abuse and the excessive hurt of children. My 3 points of contention are, first of all, with their policy, second, on the harms of smacking, and lastly, on this idea of the legitimacy of punishing your child with physical punishment. Now, my quibble with their policy is very simple. Sometimes the effects of physical punishment are imperceptible. They've given you an extreme case where a child is always bruised, where a child is always bleeding. We tell you this is not the case. If they truly want this policy to work, and their policy must work for them to win this debate, we tell you they're going to have to tell us how exactly they're going to be able to bring parents to justice when the harms to the child may be imperceptible. We think that they need to answer this before they can win this debate. So that's the policy issue. Now I want to deal with the second issue I had, the harms of smacking. Now they gave us a couple of justifications for this. First of all, about emotional harms. And we tell you that raising your voice at your child, telling your child, I'm sorry, but you need to stand in a corner now, is just as emotionally harmful as smacking a child based on the yardstick that they've given us. We asked this in a point of information. Their speaker said we're going to get back to you on it. They never did, ladies and gentlemen, and we tell you because of that, they don't really have an answer. This point doesn't stand. The other justification they've given us is that parents are bullies. But ladies and gentlemen, again, they're being very extreme about their characterization of parents, suggesting that parents will only hit their child and not talk to their child before that or after that, explaining to him what he did wrong and how he can correct his behavior. Go ahead.
Even if they explain to the child at the same time, the child is distracted by the pain and doesn't get what the parent's talking about, so it's very ineffective.
What if the parent explains to the child before he hits him? What if he says, you've done something wrong, John.
Sir?
It's not acceptable to run around in a train station because you might fall on the tracks. I'm going to spank you now because you were wrong. I don't think the child is distracted. I think you can explain pretty well. Parents are not bullies. Finally, parents might go too far. And this is quite funny, ladies and gentlemen, because if parents can lose self-control on our side of the house, they can similarly lose self-control on their side of the house as well. And we say that when parents lose self-control on our side of the house, we can take them to justice because we've got legitimate reasons that where we don't allow parents to abuse their children. My second point now has to deal with legitimacy. And the principle of this point is that all violence is bad. And we tell you that's not necessarily the case. There are circumstances in other parts of society where violence is acceptable. For instance, when the police is bringing a suspect to justice, sometimes heavy-handed behavior is required. We say the principle that needs to be used here is the extent of this violence and the proportionality of this violence. And if the proportionality is not great, then, ladies and gentlemen, we find it acceptable. If the intent is not malicious and it is to educate and teach a child, then we don't find that violence unacceptable either. Team opposition is going to prove to you that because protecting the child does not mean denigrating the institution and the autonomy of a parent, we would allow parents to physically punish their child. We're going to do this through three main arguments. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about parental autonomy. Second, I'm going to be discussing the legitimacy of physical punishment. And this is also going to deal with some of their constructive matter. And my second speaker is going to be discussing reducing the burden on social services. So, parental autonomy. Parents are granted autonomy over their child. This is because parents are the best agents that know the nature of their child and the best interests of their child. This is because parents have a degree of closeness with their children. They spend the most amount of time with their parent, with their child. They certainly spend more time with their child than team proposition and the state. These parents have specific contextual knowledge about the nature of their child. They know that their 6-year-old might be particularly mischievous and particularly vivacious and is not inclined to listen to them when they reason with him very nicely. And so, in that particular case, they might say, maybe I'm going to smack him. But if their 12-year-old is a bit more mature and is able to understand this counseling, then maybe they won't. No, thank you, sir. They know what approach is best for their child, because some children respond better to physical punishment than others. And this is why we grant parents autonomy. Because we recognize that with an institution like parenting, where there is no hard and fast rule, and there are many grey areas, then a nuanced and specific approach, for each particular child is what's best for that child. Not a blunted approach that is not specific and is uniform that you are offering me, madam. Defend it.
There are hard and fast rules in society. You can't hurt adults. You definitely should be able to hurt children, sir.
Madam, I've already explained to you why in certain contexts you can hurt adults if the intent is acceptable, if the proportionality is not great. You've got to deal with that and tell me why that same principle doesn't extend to children as well. So moving back to my constructive analysis, I'm going to take you through the second layer of this analysis, and that parental autonomy exists in all other sectors as well. We allow parents the right to decide things of great consequence, like the education of their child, like the healthcare of their child. They can decide what school their child goes to, and we tell you this is a major impact on their child. They can decide whether or not their child should go for a particular surgery. I think whether or not your child should get chemotherapy is a bigger decision than whether or not you're allowed to spank your child. If we allow parents that autonomy, why don't we allow them the autonomy in this particular case? In accordance with this principle then, ladies and gentlemen, parents should have autonomy within the boundaries of abuse. My second point of substantive has to do with the legitimacy of physical punishment. We tell you that physical punishment can be effective for a child to learn good and social behavior that we regard as a positive thing, because it attaches a tangible and punitive effect for an infraction or for unacceptable behavior. Some parents may disagree with this, but some parents may feel that this punitive consequence in the form of a physical punishment is a positive thing for their child. We don't think that it's the only method of parenting, but we recognize that it is one of a range of methods that parents have at their disposal to help their child. Parents should have access to this full range of punishment because of the parental autonomy that I explained earlier on. What has team opposition proved to you then? We've proved to you that there exists a range of punishments and parents should have access to this full range. That parental autonomy applies in so many sectors and it must apply in the home as well. And that finally, using the physical punishment is not violence that is disproportionate and unacceptable. And for all these reasons, I say keep team proposition and the government out of my home and out of a child's life.
There's violence on our streets and on our screens. There's violence in our classrooms and there's violence in our public life. But Team England today tell you that violence begins at home. Jack's already told you about the harms of smacking and the illegitimacy of smacking. I'm going to look in my speech at the results of smacking, both why we think it's an ineffective punishment and why it normalises violence. Because Team England today tell you that violence is never acceptable and it's never the answer. But before I do that, let's take a little look at what we were told by the first opposition speaker. Now, the first thing he told us was about... Well, side opposition seem to have quite an interesting conception of what Valentine's Day is all about, ladies and gentlemen, and one I'm not sure that my girlfriend would particularly agree with. But we'll leave that for later. Frankly, we think love is about showing your affection. Firstly, there was this issue of child abuse. Now, side opposition seem not quite to understand what child abuse means in most countries around the world. Because child abuse doesn't just involve permanent harms, which are the kinds of things that we stand against. Child abuse is actually a very extreme standard, and it's one that we want to extend, because we think they're not clear on it. No thanks, sir. Moreover, we say they're not clear on where the line between child abuse and a firm tap lies. Now, they had a quibble with our policy. Would people observe this? Well, frankly, we say, if they're so cynical as to think that people don't observe the laws of justice just because they are laws, and that actually lots of parents will do this because the state has told them to do so, and it's a good idea, we think that's quite sad. Secondly, no thanks, they had this thing about emotional harms, and they weren't clear why those were different to physical ones. Well, let me ask you a question. What's worse? If I shout at you really, really loudly as an adult, or if I come and punch you? We think that adults see the distinction in exactly the same way children do. Thirdly, there was this issue of going too far. No thanks, sir. Well, actually, they kind of missed the point of Jack's argument, which was that we want to send a firm message, because we don't always trust parents, once they are already in the act of smacking, to control themselves. We want them never to be in that position because they know that that is illegal. Their first argument was about parental autonomy, and they told us a lot about closeness. Well, we think closeness can equally make parents very irrational. If your 6-year-old keeps not doing what you tell them, we think that that is exactly as likely to make you smack them hard when that's not the appropriate strategy because you're frustrated with them, as it is, no thanks, sir, to make you the best judge of how they should be punished. Moreover, if they love parental autonomy so much, they've given us no clear reason why they're not going to extend parental autonomy to allow parents to abuse their children as well, why they're drawing this really fixed line. No thanks, sir. They never gave us any explanation of where they drew their distinction. Their second argument was about effectiveness, and that clashes very neatly with what I'm going to say in my substantive case about the results of smacking. But before I do, yes.
If you think parents are so irrational whenever it comes to talking about children, then take away all their rights, don't just stop at physical
No,
punishment.
thank you very much, sir. We say that there are clearly decisions that parents can make in the best interests of their child in the cold light of day, like how they should be educated, because that's not something that's likely to make them irrational and need restriction. Smacking, on the other hand, is, because your children troubling you constantly is likely to make you irrational. Why is this an ineffective punishment? Well, we say that the end goal of any punishment for a child should be to teach them the difference between right and wrong so that they observe the rules and laws that society has established. Now, because you can't punish them for every single rule they might ever break, you need them to understand the principles behind those rules and laws. Because whilst there is a distinction between nicking a chocolate bar from a shop and your classmate's book, what we want is for children to understand the fundamental principle behind that, which is that stealing is wrong, so that they don't break any of those rules. So any punishment has to come with an effective explanation of the theory behind the rules that we impose on our children. Why does that not happen when parents smack them? For 3 reasons. Firstly, because smacking, we think, is often a substitute for an explanation, not accompanied by it. No, thank you, sir. It's frankly naive of Team Singapore to stand up here and tell you today that parents will always, in that heat of the moment, explain something to their children and then smack them, when they've conceded that actually they can lose their temper in those situations. And even, ladies and gentlemen, even if they shout, the point is that other forms of punishment require you to verbalise what it is that the child has done wrong, and therefore explain it to them. So even when you're yelling, you are giving them an explanation of why what they have done is bad. Secondly, even if they do give the explanation in the lovely world full of roses and bunnies and Valentine's Day hearts that Team Singapore have presented you with, that's overshadowed by the pain of the smack. Because by the time that explanation comes, the child is on the floor crying. The child fears that parent. The child isn't thinking about the explanation of right and wrong because the child is in pain. So that explanation gets overshadowed and becomes meaningless. Yes, sir.
Explain to me how yelling isn't a substitute, as you put it, and why you wouldn't ban it.
Thank you, sir, because when you yell at a child, you verbalise what it is they are doing wrong. You say, that was wrong, you are not allowed to steal, and therefore you actually explain it to the child using words. That's why yelling is better than a smack, because it involves verbalisation. Thirdly, we think children lose respect for parents in these situations. Because if the message that parents generally try and send out when they're trying to love their children and inculcate them in society's values is that violence is bad, and then parents smack them, which is a form of violence, then that's a fundamentally contradictory message. So parents make no sense to these children. They become illegitimate, and therefore we think that any punishment becomes confused and becomes meaningless. Moreover, we think, no thank you, that smacking normalises violence. Because these children recognise that when they do something their parents don't like, they get smacked. But they don't recognise why, because it never gets explained to them. What that teaches you is that when somebody does something you don't like, the appropriate response is to hit them in anger. So violence becomes a regular part of your existence. You watch your siblings get smacked as a means of resolving disputes. You get smacked as a means of resolving disputes. And ultimately, the taboo on violence, which we think is so very important, is absolutely lost. Why is that bad? Well, firstly, it leads to bullying, and plenty of studies show that people that bully other children are much more likely to be smacked in the home. We think it desensitises children to violence, which means that they won't respond to bullying in a negative way. We also think it removes the taboo on groups which use violence, be they gangs or groups of bullies in the playground. So overall, violence is furthered. Violence is never acceptable, and it's never the answer, and thus we beg to propose.
I'm going to reduce and explain how their case has been very reductive. because the fundamental principles they've been bringing to us, when distilled to a certain point, reveal that their case is actually basically extraordinarily ridiculous. I'm going to show you why in 3 main points of rebuttal. Number 1, about their policy. Number 2, about the harms they say physical punishments will bring about. And number 3, about this issue of parental autonomy. Do parents deserve to care for their children in the way they so desire? First of all, let's talk about their policy, right? They come up to tell us, no, child abuse is not in this debate. We only want to extend the principle because child abuse is an especially extreme case of violence. And that's exactly what we're saying. We're saying every law and every piece of legislation is inherently a balance. It's a balance between the consequence upon the child and the autonomy that you're offering a parent. We'll prove to you, in fact, that the harms they're bringing about when it comes to only cases of tapping a child on the wrist or caning him are not going to be enough to warrant the removal and the complete abolishment of parental autonomy. No, thank you, sir. They go on and defend our attacks on their policy by saying, well, parents know it's illegal. This is perfectly enough for them to say, we're going to stop violence entirely. We don't buy that at all. Think about it for a moment. If a parent knows he's perfectly safe within the confines of his home and believes, as we do, that certain parents know what is best for their child and that physical punishment is going to be a good thing, without the force of the law saying, you can't do this or you face punishment, their law is effectively useless. There is no bite behind their bark. We can't buy that. And in fact, retrogrades the very principle of violence being always bad in society that they've been trying to tell us. No, thank you, sir. If you can't bring us a policy that works in terms of enforcement, then you've already lost this debate. My second point of contention is about the harms upon the child, and there are 3 main ones. First of all, emotional harms. They tell us, wait, there's going to be some kind of intense trauma we're bringing upon the child if we cane him, even if it's once off. Well, my mom caned me. I don't see, and I don't hate my mom for this reason. Just because a parent decides to explain the decision to the child, decides to physically punish him, does not always mean, no thank you sir, in their reductive way, that this child is going to be traumatized and emotionally scarred for life. They haven't proven this causal link. They go on to say and defend their principle by saying, hey, yelling is fundamentally different from physical punishment. They haven't heard my coach yell at me before. I'm emotionally scarred when that happens. More importantly, we realize, no thank you sir, that yelling, if it verbalizes certain thoughts, can also be transferred onto physical punishment. You can always verbalize as you're hitting the kid as to why, no thank you madam, as to why exactly your punishment is taking place, as to why this child is being punished, how he wants to change. More importantly, it brings about tangible consequences, no thank you, and constraints within which this child operates and understands why exactly he's being punished and how he cannot do it again. It's even more important that this emotional connection takes place.
Sir?
They move on to say, no thank you, sir, that physical harms are going to take place. We will stop at some point. Hence, They say physical harms will take place, and therefore parents cannot stop at some point. They will always lose control because they know the law. But think about it. If parents are at that point, losing control in the heat of the moment, they're irrational. Are they always going to consider the law? They will not stop. They will lose control in their case as well. They haven't really proven their case. No, sir. Let's move on to Ben's point of substantive. He says the results are bad because parents don't necessarily explain these decisions. But think about it. Is punishment always a random decision? Is hitting a child because you want to hit him always the calculus behind a parent? Parents love their kids, no thank you sir. We don't think parents are going to hit them randomly. They will explain, and they will do this in the best interest of the child, and explain as well why they're being punished. Hence the results are going to be as tangible and going to be as effective upon the child in changing his behavior. No thank you. He goes on to say, we normalize violence. Well, think about this for a moment. Are we always saying that these forms of violence are going to be excessive, such that a child is somehow desensitized to the violence around him? No. There are so many different causes as to why children become more violent in school. For example, violent television films. They can't tell me that this is the only causal links that's taking place. More importantly, we believe that, as Anish has already told you, there are going to be tangible consequences upon the child that, no thank you sir, mirrors the exact kind of constraints that a child will face in the real world when it comes to the law. Hence, they have not responded at all, no thank you sir, to what our side is standing for, real change. The third thing we're going to talk about is parental autonomy. They say we're going to extend this principle of parental autonomy. When it comes to physical violence. Think about it for a moment. The state is always acting in the best interest when they use violence. Hence, the state sometimes transfers this right and monopoly over violence to the parent. When the parent does indeed abuse it, as in cases of
Sir.
child abuse, no thank you sir, then they surrender it to the child. We believe that there's always going to be a cross-check. The states can check the parents and parents can check the states through the vote. You cannot propose that the right to physical punishment is always robbed and taken away from the parents. No thank you sir. You haven't responded to exactly why it is that physical violence is not a right that a parent cannot take place within this balance and matrix of rights.
Sir?
That being said, no sir. I'm going to move on to my point of substantive about reducing our burden on social services. And the thesis is that giving social services the superfluous burden of supervising random cases of physical punishment overstretches our social services. Premise number one is that social services now are already overstretched. There are too many families that these people must oversee because, one, parents sometimes have a history of child abuse or their dysfunctional family environments. Therefore, there are grievous cases of child abuse that do indeed fall under the radar right now. In Britain, baby P, a few months old, was brutally tortured by his parents to the point of death, and they only discovered it when his body was dumped outside of the home. Given, no thank you sir, that there are so many cases left to check through and investigate, that the proposition policy is going to make this burden even more intense upon the individual. Hang on there, sir. How exactly are they going to police everybody? They haven't given us an exact answer. Yes, sir.
Baby P was covered in bruises from the time he was born, which weren't spotted by doctors and social workers, because smacking was a justification for those bruises.
No, sir. Baby P was not discovered because social service workers were unable to check at that point in time. They were so overstretched, and you're going to make that burden even worse because social service workers are going to have to go around checking on superfluous cases. Let me explain why this takes place. For example, we're going to say that their social service investigations are going to take place at such regular intervals for so many different people that, for example, if a parent finds his child constantly refuses to listen to scolding because he keeps getting hauled up to his principal's office, then in this frustration, no thank you, and his desire for his child to be good, he hits him. In these cases, we think the parent does it out of love, out of concern for the child, but their social services are going to check up on this parent, going to investigate. This is one, a ridiculous and patently untenable situation. More importantly, it diverts away social resources to meaningless investigations that could have been better diverted to more powerful and more necessary checks. We believe that already overstretched services, therefore, are forgetting the real cases of abuse. They're hurting the children who really need our help. Furthermore, the institution of parenthood is undermined and denigrated because social services are going to go around checking up on parents. How will these parents look like if people are coming to their houses every day, to the community, to the neighbors, to their family? Are they going to be portrayed as some kind of social psychopath just because the proposition believes that physical violence can never be justified? We believe this is undermining the very parental confidence that we need to instill in parents in order to preserve their parental autonomy. The opposition, therefore, believes that we must let social services focus on the cases which demand real attention. Cases of intense child abuse, where social services need to check on families with such a history, with such a track record of abuse. In summary, our side of the house has shown that their policy has no real enforcement mechanism, that second of all, the harms they're bringing about are in fact phantom and illusory, third of all, that parental autonomy needs to be preserved and their policy only undermines this, and last of all, that we want to make sure social services focus on the children who really need help. This debate has clearly gone to opposition.
A parent hits their child. They tear through the very basis of our society, ladies and gentlemen. And on Team England today, we've shown you why smacking is harmful, why it's illegitimate, and why its results are always bad. And in my speech today, I'm going to take a really good look at what we've heard from Team Singapore and show you why Team England's arguments still stand and are still crucial to this debate. I'm going to look at the idea of social services, which is what we've just heard from Singapore. I'm going to look at whether we think there are harms to smacking. I'm going to look at what we think the rights of the parents are in this case. And then finally, I'm going to look at whether we think smacking is an effective form of punishment. But let's crack on. Let's look straight at this idea of social services, which is what we just heard from Team Singapore. Because they said social services are currently overstretched and they won't be able to go out and see every case of parents and see whether parents are hitting their children. And we think there's lots of responses to this. Firstly, we think it's not just the job of social services to pick up on harms. We think teachers and doctors play a crucial role here and are very capable of sending children to social services and referring them if there's a problem. They cited the example of baby P. Well, the thing about baby P is he was seen by doctors 19 times, and we think if smacking had been entirely illegal, they would have picked up that what the parents were doing was wrong, and he would have been saved under our model, not under yours. And then they tried to tell you that this was diverting resources from important cases. I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, but to me, protecting children from physical harm does not seem resources. And if the social services are overstretched, we can just make them bigger, because we think protecting children is a fundamental part of our society.
Some information, madam.
No, thank you. And then they said, well, this kind of creates a stigma because social services will be in and out everyone's houses. And there's two responses to this. If social services are in and out everyone's houses, then there's no stigma because it's happening to anyone. But moreover, we think if you're not hitting your children, then we think most parents will be fine. We think if they're good parents, they shouldn't get worried. But let's look at this idea now of harms. Because in Singapore, recognise that hitting children can be very harmful because they don't stand for child abuse. But they never told you when they thought child abuse started to happen. They just made some vague notion about it being quite extreme. Well, we think if they recognise that abuse is harmful, they should recognise that all violence is harmful. And we told you violence is harmful. No, thank you. Firstly, because of the emotional harms it causes, the fact that it violates that child's person, it causes them humiliation, it causes a breakdown of their relationship with their parents, which are very harmful to them. And they said, well, why is this worse than other forms of punishment? Well, someone shouting at you doesn't violate your person in the same way. That's why we might shout at other adults, but we don't hit them. No, thank you. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, there's quite a big contradiction in Singapore's case here. Because if other punishments are as bad as smacking, then why is smacking necessary in the first place? And their whole arguments about why, when we'd use smacking, no longer stand. So we think actually, firstly, there are harms to smacking, and that's why they recognise it as a separate form of punishment. And secondly, these harms are different to someone shouting at you, because when they shout at you, they have to verbalise what you've done wrong, rather than just hit you.
We're saying that there's no contradiction because different kinds of punishment must be tailored to different kinds of children. That's a point you've never responded to in any of your speakers.
No, we think that hitting a child is never in their best interest. It's always bad. So let's move on to parental autonomy.
Madam?
Because they said parents know the nature of their children best. Well, we say two things to this. Firstly, when parents are angry and irrational, they won't necessarily do the same thing. And they recognise parents are angry when they smack their children. So we think that this point about parents knowing the best interest doesn't help. But secondly, we just think that hitting a child is never in their best interest because of the massive physical and emotional harms that we showed you. And there are lots of things we don't let parents do because we recognise they could never be in the child's best interest, like abuse. And we see this violence is as harmful as abuse because violence by its very nature is harmful and causes massive physical and emotional harms. And their second line of analysis as to why parental autonomy is important is that there's lots of other things we let parents do. Good, ladies and gentlemen, there's lots of things we let adults in society do. Hitting each other is not one of them. We don't think just because parents have some rights mean they have the right to hit their children. And that was the only analysis we really heard. And they said, well, parents can pick a school for their child. Firstly, parents pick schools with lots of information, not when they're angry, not when they're irrational. But secondly, in the majority of countries, parents can't decide not to send their children to school. Like, we give them some freedom, but we don't leave it completely unrestricted. Like, we let parents punish their children, but we don't let them hit them. And so we think that's perfectly consistent. And we don't think they should let parents harm them. And then a bit later from Singapore, we heard some analysis about the fact that the state was allowed to use violence, and therefore parents should be allowed to use violence. Right. States are allowed to have the monopoly on violence because that's what makes them states and makes them capable in enforcing law and order. The argument that the state can sometimes use violence, therefore everyone else should be able to, is not an argument for allowing parents to hit their children. It's an argument for the breakdown of society. So we don't think that stands either. So let's finally go on to this idea of whether we think that smacking is an effective form of punishment. Because they've told you that parents should be offered the full range of punishments and that sometimes smacking can be in the child's best interest. But we've told you often smacking takes place instead of a verbalisation of what that child has done wrong. Or, even if it comes alongside a verbalisation, we think that it completely undermines the verbalisation. Yes, sir.
Haven't you ever considered the effect on the child when you take away a parent who loves him, even though you may hit him just once?
Well, we think, firstly, we told you there's a sliding scale, so we think probably that parent won't be taken away. But moreover, we think if that parent is continually hitting that child, that harm is really massive to that child, and that's far worse. No, thank you. So, let's get back to why this punishment is ineffective. Because Singapore recognise that they want the child to understand why something is wrong. But what they don't recognise is that if someone hits you, either they just hit you, and that's not telling you why it's wrong. Or you're completely overshadowed by the fact that you're in pain and your parents who are meant to protect you have just gone and hit you. And that completely undermines any effectiveness the punishment has. And moreover, this kind of punishment is completely ineffective in teaching values, as Ben told you. Because often one of the values we wish to teach children by punishing them is that hitting people is not okay. And we don't think it makes much sense to try and teach a child that hitting people is not okay by hitting them, because they get this very confused message. They don't really understand whether hitting people is okay or not. All they understand is that their parents are contradicting themselves. They lose respect for their parents. They're not likely to recognise that their parents are legitimate people and punishing them who they should listen to, because, well, their parents are a bit contradictory. They're not good people to listen to. And so that's why it's a completely ineffective punishment. So, ladies and gentlemen, what does this debate come down to? This debate has come down to the harms of smacking. And we think there are massive harms of smacking. And we think actually Singapore recognise that because they know child abuse is harmful. And we say violence is just as harmful because of the harms it causes children. And secondly, we've talked to you about whether this is effective. And we've shown you this is massively ineffective. And thirdly, this debate has come down to the idea of parental autonomy. And we say we limit parental autonomy laws. We particularly limit parental autonomy in order to protect the rights of the child, their physical rights, their physical person, those inalienable rights they are born with, that their physical person should not be harmed. They have that negative liberty on birth. So on this side of the house, ladies and gentlemen, violence is never acceptable and it's definitely never the answer.
10 years, 20 years down the road, I might have a child. And that kid doesn't want to do his homework. No matter how many times I tell him, homework's good for you. It helps you to learn. He just won't do it. He feeds it to his dog, he throws it in the basket, he drenches it in water. Maybe one day, I wrap my child lightly over the knuckles. And then social services come to my house and say, you are an irresponsible parent. We will now check on you. Day after day, time after time. Or we will fine you. We will castigate you under the law. Is this fair to me? Is this fair to my child, who must live with a parent who lives under the spectre of as being labelled as irresponsible, when all he wanted to do was love his child in his own manner? I'm going to show you three questions today that Team England don't care about parents, child, and society itself. My first question is this: what are parents like? My second question is this: what is their policy like? And my third question is this: what is in the child's best interest? So let's ask the first question. What are parents like? Now, Team England has given us a very extreme characterization of parents as being irrational. Then, well, they modified it later to say they're only irrational in the specific case of smacking a child. Now we've asked you a question. If you're so angry at the misdeed a child has done that you smack him irrationally, why are you rational when you yell at him? Why somehow does this miraculous transformation take place that you are able to verbalize the problems a child has done, when in the first case, you are irrational under the exact same scenario? There is no proof of this. The next thing they said is, well, okay, parents are irrational here, so we take away their rights here because parents are stressed. Wait a moment. When your child goes for chemotherapy and you're asked to make the decision on whether to do it on him or not, aren't you stressed? It's your child's life at stake here. The life and his possible future as someone you love. Aren't you stressed then? And if we give the parents the rights to decide medical treatment for their child, no matter how stressed they might be, why don't we give them the right here as well? They've told us, well, if smacking and scolding is the same, then we should just eliminate one of them since there's no need for two reasons. But we say, no. If smacking and scolding are the same, and this is what we've said all along, shouldn't we give parents the full range of options to decide which to use on a child, since sometimes physical means might carry through to a child better than another mean? So it isn't contradiction at all for us to say that. But fundamentally, we've said this from the start, Team England has no right to tell a parent what to do with his child. Because no matter how many doctors tell you that MMR, measles, mumps and rubella vaccinations don't cause autism, or only a tiny little minor sliver of a chance of autism, parents have the right to reject that vaccination. Because we as the state assume a parent has the best interest of his child at heart and trust the parent to do the cost-benefit analysis, no thank you sir, that is necessary for the safety of his child. We take this away in cases of abuse, yes, because the extremity of abuse has shown us clearly that that parent doesn't have the best interest of his child at heart. And abuse is, if you wait a while, so very clearly different from smacking. Because it's one thing to go to a doctor with a light harm print on your hand, and another thing to go to a doctor with a broken arm, because that is permanent damage and that is excessive violence. Yes, sir?
So exactly when does inflicting pain on a child become criminal abuse?
When we've told you, number one, it's excessive. Number two, it causes permanent physical harm on the child, like a breaking of the bone. We've said states do this all the time when deciding the difference between a minor scuffle or a full-fledged assault and battery, and if they can do it then, they can do it now, and there's no reason for you to complain.
Sir?
The next thing they've told us is violence can never be used in society. We've come back to this. We've said sometimes the state transfers rights to a parent. For instance, only I have the capability to decide what medical treatment I can do to myself. But the state transfers this to the parent, because the parent is the legal guardian and ward of the child. We've told you the state can do this in the exact same scenario as well. Transfer the right to a parent because the parent is the legal guardian and ward of the child. Now they haven't answered us on this point, and therefore we tell you it stands. Now let's go on to my next question. What about the policy? We've asked them time and again to show us how they can enforce their policy when it takes place in the home. And many times the sort of damage the child done to the child through physical punishment is untangible and cannot be seen by people like doctors or teachers. The times when it can be seen is when obviously the child has broken an arm or damaged his face or something like that, which is clearly excessive violence and abuse. So we can tell abuse, but we can't tell when you have physically punished the child. Now, we told you the option, no thank you sir, is to send social services to everybody's home or admit that your policy can't be enforced. They've conceded to this by saying, well, okay, we'll expand social services, I suppose for the reason of sending it to everybody's home. Firstly, we've tried to expand social services time and again, but we can't because number one, we are in a recession and our budget's pretty tight, and number two, there's certainly a limit to the amount of social services, no thank you sir, a government can employ without compromising on quality. Now we've told you about the example of baby P and they've told you, no, this is because smacking wasn't illegal. But our side tells you the reason why baby P was overlooked. It was because doctors and social services were too tired of checking on some cases of smacking only to discover it was light physical punishment by a parent who really loved the child. By eliminating the need for doctors and social services to check on all these tangential cases, you can focus on the cases like baby P. So when a baby is taken to the doctor covered in bruises, the doctor knows that there is abuse and he will go there. Rather than being frustrated at checking out every single little minor case that's brought to him and ignore it because of his frustration. We've told them that, they haven't answered. And finally, in my second speaker substantive, we've drawn a new link. If you wait a while, madam, we've asked you the perception of the family. What happens to the perception of the family and of the child to his father when social services constantly check on your household after maybe a light rap on your child's knuckles? We tell you this is wrong because it denigrates the opinion the child has of a parent, something which they care a lot about. Yes, madam?
Smacking is legal in the UK. There weren't overstretched social workers looking at smacking cases. The point is they weren't looking for physical abuse. That's why baby P happened.
No, madam. I'm sure they were looking for physical abuse because when you bring a child to a doctor with the bruises and tell the doctor you suspect abuse is happening, they go and check. And they will go and check. And if you think that smacking necessarily is legal in the United Kingdom, then our side tells you, no thank you sir, that the same scenario can happen in other countries around the world. And because of this, ladies and gentlemen, baby P is a scenario that was number one, not likely to happen, and number two, under our side's policy, easily preventable, because the extent of abuses to baby P also was covered in child abuse itself. So let's go on to my next question. What is in a child's best interest? Is it taking away the parent that has looked after the child simply because of a minor infringement, or is it giving the parent the benefit of the doubt that we expect of parents in general, because we accept that they have the value of a child at heart? They've told us they have a sliding scale, but we tell you any punishment is dangerous. Because any punishment forces the parent to live under the spectre that he has been labelled as irresponsible, to live under the spectre that he has been labelled as irrational, and the child to constantly question whether he's being raised in the right response to that parent itself. So our side tells you, firstly, because parents are not as extreme as England has characterized it, because we're debating on the middle rather than the extremes, and because parents are trusted with the best interest of the child at heart, and the child is only harmed by their side's policy, go with side opposition.
A side out of touch with reality. A side with reductive principles inconsistent with the way our society truly works, and a side without the best interests of the parent and the child at heart. That is the side of the proposition, and today we all must reject it. Let's take a look at the sort of world the proposition is presenting us with. They've given us a world where they want to ban all physical punishment of children. And they want to do this with a policy that doesn't work. They want to do this with a policy where they can't ever ascertain whether or not a child has actually been hit. Because sometimes those sorts of physical activities don't leave a mark. If their policy cannot work, then they cannot carry out their principle, and therefore they cannot take this debate. They've given us several justifications for this unworkable policy. And the first is that there are harms. One of those harms was emotional harms. And we've told you that lots of other things that they don't want to ban cause similar emotional harms. For instance, raising your voice at a child can be just as traumatizing as spanking him, because that child doesn't have the same capacity as an adult. Raising your voice at him has the same emotional effect. But we tell you that all across the board, this emotional effect isn't great, because you don't grow up to hate your parents just because you have been smacked. And if you do, it's because we're looking at an extreme case where there possibly was abuse, and in those cases, we are going to take action. They've talked to us about physical harms as well. And we told you that in the vast majority of cases where this debate must take place, those physical harms don't manifest, because the sort of punishment we're looking at isn't excessively violent. And if it is excessively violent, we told you, based on the yardstick that courts of law have been using for such a long time, we can bring these parents to justice. Then they told us the reason why we want to ban this is because violence is always bad. And we told you there have been so many instances in society when the state legitimizes the use of violence. And they do that in circumstances where the proportion is acceptable and where the intent is not malicious. We gave this to you right at the top of this debate, and this is something I never really grappled with, because they have a principle that doesn't square with the way our society works. Violence can be acceptable in circumstances where it's done in the best interest of the child. Then they told us about effectiveness, that the child won't learn. And we told you the vast majority of parents are measured and controlled in their punishment, and they verbalize the sort of learning lessons they want the child to take away from this punishment. And we tell you that even if they so want verbalization, they don't really have it on their side as well. Because we say that when they have a parent who yells, and that's their alternative to spanking, then this parent is not truly verbalizing because he's angry and he's just yelling. He's not actually verbalizing to the child what he's done wrong. So we tell you they don't actually have a case. The world of the opposition, however, is one that's more square with society. Because we respect parental autonomy. Because we recognize the nature of parenthood is one where you need to tailor to the child, and where a simple, uniform rule that they propose is not always the best. We told you that spanking sometimes is a legitimate tool of punishment because it sets clear boundaries on what is right and wrong, and a young child sometimes needs this. And we talked to you about social services and how they're stretching social services unnecessarily on cases that don't warrant attention. And in all those cases, we tell you, ladies and gentlemen, someone is going to be missed, and that's a problem. For all these reasons, we say we would preserve the institution of parenthood and the right of parents to do what they think is best for their child.
Debaters could be geeky enough to spend February the 14th arguing about violence, ladies and gentlemen, but whereas Team England today have brought you a model of loving care, Team Singapore have given you a Valentine's Day massacre. We've told you why this is harmful, we've told you why it's illegitimate, and we've told you why it has negative results. Because violence is never acceptable, and it's never the answer. I'm going to address the clash in this debate under two questions. First, is it illegitimate for parents to smack their children? Secondly, does this impact negatively on society? The first thing we told you right out of first prop was that this has extraordinary harms, both physical, in terms of the pain it causes the child, and emotional, in terms of the fear, the loss of self-esteem, the breakdown of that most important relationship, that between parent and child, and those harms are concrete. We've told you explicitly why those are worse than in other forms of punishment. Firstly, because clearly yelling doesn't involve inflicting physical pain, but secondly, because we say it is clear that physical pain is worse for children in the same way that it is considered worse for adults. And this is where this business about characterisation that Singapore have been trying to pull gets interesting, ladies and gentlemen, because we've never tried to characterise all parents as being violent. In fact, we were very explicit out of first prop not to do that. What we told you was that even the best parents with the best intentions can get irrational when they're angry and when they're frustrated and when they are already in the act of hitting the child as a punishment. And that's why physical punishment is so very dangerous and must be stopped. Moreover, we told you that protecting people is a state's very first duty, because you don't need rational cognition in order to want your person protected, which is why it has to be protected for children as well. And what Singapore gave back to us was parental autonomy. And they said parents should be allowed to do what they like, because they know their kids. Oh, well, except we concede that sometimes it's legitimate to limit parental autonomy when there are concrete harms, like in cases of child abuse, which we say essentially brings us back to this first point about us showing you that there are very concrete harms that mean this is not in a child's best interests. Moreover, this business about, well, the state delegating the right to be violent. The state doesn't delegate the right to be violent, ladies and gentlemen, it maintains it for itself, because that's what makes it a state. So we think that proves that this is illegitimate and therefore must be banned. Secondly, does this impact negatively on society? Now, I'd like to clear up this business about enforcement right out of the gate. Firstly, saying that a law sometimes doesn't get enforced, an argument against all laws. A debating argument I'm sure we've all heard before, but it's worth hearing again, because it's not an argument specifically against this proposition. Moreover, we told you out of second prop that we think most people will observe these laws, because the majority of laws don't get observed because people think there's a risk of getting caught. They get observed because the state has made a moral judgment that says, you can't do that. We told you why this was an ineffective punishment, because it was contradictory if you wanted to teach people that violence was bad, because you had to verbalise. Even if you're yelling, you are kind of definitionally verbalising, because you're shouting words, which gives children an explanation. And we told you that the pain overshadows the explanation when you smack. We told you that this normalises violence. And lastly, there was a bit of chat about social services, where their best example happened 20 minutes from my door. And the reason it happened was because doctors were not able to spot that bruises were a sign of abuse because the parents used smacking as an excuse, not because doctors were overstretched looking out for the legal activity of smacking in the United Kingdom. Violence is always unacceptable, and it's never the answer, and thus we beg to propose.